This session is titled Working with Datetime Data. My name is Gary McDougall, and presenting with me is Tanu Hoke. In this session, we'll discuss date fields in map services and feature services. I'll start with an overview of how date fields work with these services. Then Tanu will discuss some new enhancements that we have recently added. So let's get started with an overview of date fields in map services and feature services. Date field values are returned from map service and feature services in Unix epoch time. This is, by definition, in UTC. If we look at the example below, you will see that the date value returned is the number of milliseconds from epoch. That's the large integer value in the red rectangle. This converted using an epoch converter app is May 24th, 2021 at 4:37:53 p.m., which is 9:37:53 a.m. in my local time Pacific. Since the date values need to be in UTC, the services need to know the time zone of the data in order to convert the values correctly to UTC. The date field types from the data sources we support do not have time zone information, so we provide three ways to define the date field time zones. The first is for date fields used in time-aware layers. The second is with editor tracking fields. And the third is a time zone you can define when publishing that applies to all other date fields. Any or none of these may be defined in a service. If a time zone is not defined, it is assumed to be in UTC, and values are not converted by the services. A layer can be defined as time-aware in ArcMap or Pro. This is used by the time slider control. When published, the time-aware settings are exposed by the map service or feature service. The settings can include up to 2 date fields. It may also include a time zone. In the example on the right, the time properties include 1 date field and have a time zone set to Eastern Time. Editor tracking fields are system maintained and are in UTC by default. It is possible, however, to use pre-existing fields as editor tracking fields. In that case, the time zone may be defined as in database time. If the editor tracking fields are in database time, the publishing process will require a time zone to be set. This is described in the next slide. When publishing, the configuration settings include a time zone. This is described as the date field's time reference. It applies to all the date fields in the service other than those used with time-aware layers or editor tracking fields in UTC, which we just covered. For non-hosted feature or map services, this value can also be set in the server manager after publishing. When publishing hosted feature services, the data is copied to the backend data store. During the process, the date values are converted to UTC. The settings we just described are used to do the conversion. Once published, hosted feature services then always work with dates in UTC from the backend data store. This avoids the cost of conversion when working with the data. In the example in the diagram, you can see how values in Eastern Time in a file geodatabase get converted to UTC when published and returned as UTC values in query responses from the feature service. When publishing non-hosted map services and feature services, the values are not copied and thus not converted when published. They are read directly from the data source. In order to return UTC values, the map and feature services use the settings we just described to convert the values on the fly. In the example in the diagram, you can see how values in Eastern Time in a file or enterprise geodatabase get converted to UTC on the fly by the service when processing query results. When creating queries with a where clause that includes a date field value, clients must send the date values in the time zone of the data. This is because the feature and map service send the where clause directly to the database. Results are then processed and date values returned in UTC, just like all query responses. In the examples in the diagram, you can see how the application's query control takes the date values in the local time, but then converts it to the time zone of the data when sending the query request's where clause. In the case of hosted feature services, the client converts to UTC. For non-hosted feature services, the example below shows values converted to Eastern Time, as that is the time zone of the data. So how do the clients know the time zone of the data? Well, it reads the time zone info from the services layer resources. An example is shown in the screenshots below. On the left, time-aware properties reference a date field and include a time zone. In the upper right, editor tracking edit fields info also includes a UTC time zone. If the time zone is not set with the edit fields info, it will be the same as the date field's time reference. The lower right shows the date field's time reference, which applies to all other date fields. If the time zone is not set, it is assumed UTC and no conversion is applied when processing requests. When editing, just like when querying, the feature service works with UTC values. Here, clients send date values for inserts or updates in UTC. The service then converts these values to the appropriate time zone when writing to the database. If the database's date fields are in UTC, no conversion is applied. Sync also works with UTC values, just like querying and editing. Create replica and sync download converts the values to UTC, while sync upload converts the UTC from UTC to the appropriate time zone when writing to the database. Clients get date values in UTC from the service, but they can choose to convert the values to another more appropriate time zone. For web clients like the map viewer, users work in the time zone of the device on which the browser is running. The map viewer client takes care of any conversions needed. Up until recently, in ArcGIS Pro, values were read as is and not converted from the service. Later in this session, Tana will review some new options here. Now let's run through a demo showing feature services and date fields. In this demo, I have some data in Pro from an enterprise geodatabase. This is contrived data that I created to highlight the information we have been discussing in the slides. If I click on the feature, with the Explorer button, I will see 3 date fields. One is the created date field, which is an editor tracking field that is configured to be in UTC. So this field already has a known time zone. The second is called TimeAware DT Eastern. This is a field in my database that I know has values stored in the Eastern time zone. This field is used for enabling time settings on my layer. The third is called regular DT Pacific. This is just a normal date field that I know has values stored in the Pacific time zone. If you look at the values of all 3 fields, you will see that they are all actually the same moment in time, just stored in the database in 3 different time zones. Next step is to publish, but before doing so, I want to check the time settings on my layer. So if we look at the Time tab, you will see that I have my time field set to my TimeAware DT Eastern field. And I also have the time zone set to be Eastern for in my time-aware properties. Next, I click Share as Web Layer to publish the service. Now in this case, I want to publish a feature service. And I also want to set the time zone. This will define the time zone for the regular DT Pacific field. If there had been other date fields in my data, this would also define the time zone for those. Now normally I would now analyze and publish, but in this case I have already published the service. So let's look at the browser. If I scroll down, you'll see I have my date fields demo service already published. If I click on the layer and then click Query, I can then query the contents of the layer. If you look at the data, you will see that the values for all the fields are the same. This is because the feature service converted all of those to UTC in order to return a Unix epoch time. They are all the same value because, as you remember, the values in the database were all the same moment but stored in different time zones. The feature service is returning all of these values in one time zone, UTC. If we open the layer in the map viewer, and first we're going to disable time animation just for the demo. So let me click on the feature. You will see that all of the values are in Pacific time, and they're all the same. The map viewer chose to convert the UTC values from the feature service to Pacific, since my machine, on which the browser is running in the Pacific time zone. Now if I add a feature, I can set the date and time of the two editable fields. In this case, I want them both to have the same value. Again, the map viewer works in the same time zone of the machine, so I am typing in values that are in Pacific time. If we go back to Pro and look at the value of those fields in the Enterprise Geodatabase, you will see that the Pacific time value was set to be Pacific time, but the Eastern time field was set to be Eastern time. So the feature service converted the date values back to the appropriate time zone for the fields. So let's review. The date values were entered into Pacific time on the map viewer client. The map viewer then converted and sent the feature service UTC values for those fields, which is the feature service contract. And then the feature service converted the values back to the correct time zone in the database based on the time zone settings of the service. Okay, one last thing to show is hosted feature services. So if I go back to the browser and I go to my services, you will see that I've published a hosted feature service for the same data. Now in this case, when you publish from Pro, you have the choice for maintaining editor tracking values or having new ones generated when you publish. In this case, I chose to maintain the existing editor tracking values. So let's click on that service. And now let me query the values. This time I'm querying, of course, a hosted feature service, but doing the same query as before. So here you will see that the same values that we got from the non-hosted feature service also appear for the hosted feature service for the 3 fields. So the clients will see the same thing whether they work with hosted feature services or non-hosted feature services. The only difference is that with hosted feature services, the date values are actually in UTC in the backend data store. But since hosted feature services manage the data on the backend data store, you won't notice a difference when working with the data. Now I'll hand things over to Tanu to talk about some new enhancements we've added in this area.
Thanks, Gary. In my demo, I'll be talking about why it is so important to set a time zone to a map or feature service, and when and how you should use this new preferred time zone and unknown time zone. So I have some data that represents some arrests that were made related to driving under influence or DUI in the first week of January in earlier this year. As you see, the data are coming from FileG database, and it has some basic information like the description, the district the arrests were made, and the date the arrests were made. Right? And I purposefully left the time portion out of it to keep it simple, but most likely in your case, you will have both date and time. And on the right side, I have a chart that represents how many arrests that were made in each day. And then I shared it out as a map service. For enterprise setup, you can use the publishing web layer, or if you have a standalone server, you can just choose map service option, select the map, and follow this sharing pane, right? And then publish it. That's what I did. And then I actually created our web application, which in this case is a dashboard application that shows the map, attributes, and the chart, right? At the very beginning, the chart looks very similar to what we saw before, except that if you look at very closely, it says that the first bar, it says is what actually done. It was recorded or showing the data for the December 31st, right? Let me go back to my slide deck and show you the difference, right? In ArcGIS Pro versus in the dashboard application. And this is not again related to the dashboard application. Any ArcGIS web application, you will run into the same issue, right? And it again, the chart looks identical, except that in the dashboard application, the chart appears that everything happened a day earlier. Right? So why did that happen? Before I do that, let me show you how the attributes are represents in both Pro and in web application. So I'm looking at just one single incident here in ArcGIS Pro, consuming the local data from FileG database, and you see that the date says it happened on the January 2nd. The same data, when I looked in any ArcGIS web application, you will see that everything looks the same except the date. The date appears, it happened the day before. Technically, mathematically, if I say correctly, it is actually happened 8 hours before. Right? So why? The reason it happened is because when I published my map service, I did not set the time zone. And as you know, in the REST API specs, it says that the date time values, when it is going out or coming in, they must be, the one exception, they must be always in UTC. And in the map service or feature service, when there is no time zone set, it simply assumes the data are in UTC and hands it over that way. And then when it gets handed over the web application, it basically converts that UTC value to the device time zone. In my case, it happens to be in Pacific time zone. And you see that the data, the one that's when the arrests were made, appeared as if it were actually happened 8 hours before. Now to fix it, all you have to do is to set the time zone, right? In my case, when I set that time zone to Pacific, what will happen is the map or feature service, it will say, okay, I need to convert that data by applying 8-hour offset or 7-hour, depending on the daylight savings, and to convert that to UTC. Then it gets handed over to web application, and web application, it says, okay, I got the data in UTC, and then I have to convert that back to the device time zone again, which happens to be in Pacific for me. To do that, there are two ways you can do it, right? While you are publishing it, you can go to the configuration tab. There is a parameters, and you see there is something called date fields. There you can set that time zone and then publish it. Or if you have your service already published, you can go to that manager site, edit that service, go to the parameters tab, and you have this time zone option here. I can set it to the Pacific time. I make sure that this all daylight saving adjustment checkbox is checked, and I will say save and restart. And to find out whether or which time zone the data are referenced to, you can go to that service layers resources, and you can search for this keyword called date time reference. And now that I just set it to Pacific time zone, it says the data in Pacific time zone. Let me show you a query, right? So this is the query that I made before. The same, see the feature that I used in my slide deck. And here is my date only. Now, if I submit that query again, I'll just see that the values are different now. That's because now it is doing the conversion from Pacific to UTC, and before it did not. So if I just copy this value and go to this epoch converter, paste it, and you will see that it says, yeah, the date that came from map service, it is, it's January 2nd, 8 o'clock in the morning. So it's adjusted correctly. And then the application is adjusting it back to this device, my device local time zone. Okay. All right. Now that's all good. If I now go back to my dashboard application and refresh it, you see that it is correctly showing that all the values are correctly showing right now. The first bar, instead of showing it to December 31st, now it is showing January 1st, which is correct. Okay, so we're all good now. Now, what if I want to consume it back in ArcGIS Pro? Let me copy the layer URL and go back to Pro. I don't need this to add that in a new map. So if I add it now and open my attribute table and look at the data, I don't need that. See that one? Now it is showing the dates are basically like everything happened 8 hours ahead, right? So the reason it happens is because, as I mentioned, the REST API says the data must be in UTC, right? And Pro simply shows that data in UTC. So if I open the layer property page and go to the time tab, you'll see that it says the data time zone is set to UTC. You can hover over the dates and you will actually see that in the pop-up too. So what can I do to fix it? It is to fix it, all you have to do is to go back to the manager, click edit, again go back to the same page. Now you see there is a button called preferred time zone. All I have to do is to set the preferred time zone. That's basically saying, as an author, I'm asking the client application to display the data in this preferred time zone. It's up to the client's discretion whether to honor to or not. Okay. Now if I go back to Pro, I will just open that in another Pro session to avoid the local caching. Paste it now. Open the attribute table. Now you see the dates are showing correctly. There is no 8-hour shift. And if I go back to that layer property page on the time tab, now it shows the data are in a Pacific time zone. Okay, now you can ask if it is only supported by Enterprise Map Service and Feature Service. The answer is no. It is also supported by Enterprise Hosted and ArcGIS Online Hosted Feature Service. So I have this feature service from ArcGIS Online. Let me copy the URL and go to that layer resources. And if I look for that date field, time reference, you see that, of course, it is set in UTC because everything is ArcGIS Online or hosted case. Data are always in UTC. That's how they're stored the data. And the preferred time zone is set to none. And let me copy I already copied that URL, and let me bring that in ArcGIS Pro. If I add that, let's wait for it to be added, and open attribute table. You see the dates are right now basically offsetted by 8 hours, right? Again, the reason it happens because there are no preferred times on set, and a Pro is basically showing everything in UTC, right? What if I make an edit, right? Let me do it. Let me add a new feature here, and I will populate that with some attributes. I will say, let's say this happened on the 10th. Right? Applied it. I'm going to save it. Okay. So it looks good here. Now, if I go back just online and add that layer and view it in our just online map viewer, see that the attributes right now, it's, it's, it's showing it again 8 hours before. The reason it happens is again because of that one. The Pro assumes the data are in UTC, it's posted without doing the conversion, and data gets corrupted. The data are showing incorrectly stored. So now to prevent that, again, all you have to do is to set the preferred time zone. For a hosted feature service, there are actually no UI what you can use to set the preferred time zone, unfortunately. But we have a blog post that actually tells you exactly what are the steps that you need to follow in order to set that time zone, preferred time zone. The first thing is that you have to go to the admin API page, resources, and and you'll set the preferred time zone there. Um, so here I am, that service. Just go to that admin. Now is the update definition, and I have to provide a JSON. If I go back to the blog, you see that there is a JSON they are provided, but it is for some time zone in Australia, but I need something for Pacific time zone. Fortunately, we have this help doc here, and if you go to that example 5, it actually has a JSON that's for Pacific time zone. But for your time zone, you can actually go to this Microsoft page to find that the time zone ID for your time zone. Right. So I got that one provided here, update it. Now, if I go back to that service, the layer resources, now you see that preferred time zone is set to Pacific. Okay. Let me add that back in Pro. And to avoid the local caching, I will actually open that in a different session. Now paste it. Okay. Now let me add a new feature right here in Oakland area. Okay. And then I will set that fill up. I will say this time it's a test 2, test 2, and I will say, okay, this is the same one on the 10th. Now I applied it, save it. Now if I go back to web page and add now view that again in ArcGIS Online Map Viewer, And it is the one that I just added. If I click it, now you see that one. This time it's showing correctly. So now you see that why it is so important to set the time zone to begin with, so that your data will be appear correctly in both web application as well as ArcGIS Pro. And then you need to set the preferred time zone so that Pro can display and do the editing correctly. All right. Otherwise, you may run into some data corruption. Okay, let's shift gear to a different use case. In my previous demo, I had all my data coming from one single time zone. There are some use case or workflows where data comes from multiple time zones. Here is an example. I have traffic incidents data from two different cities, one from New York, another from Los Angeles. They both incidents happen exactly at 4:30 in their local time zone. And for my traffic analysis, I want to maintain their local time zone so that I can do some analysis or query to find out all the incidents that happened during rush hour. And as you know, rush hour are very local for this specific area. So my data are in enterprise database, and I can run some simple queries like, okay, find all the incidents that happen at 4:30 on one particular day. And it found those or both incidents right away. If I were to share my service, right, then I will run into some issues. Why? Because I mentioned previously that and showed you in my demo only one time zone that you can associate. But my data are coming from multiple time zones. What can be done? One strategy could be to adjust all the data to one particular time zone, right? Such as UTC and play with it. Yes, that might just work. Let's see whether that strategy works with this particular case. So I have a service already. Here's a featured service, and that where the data are all adjusted to UTC. Let me add that back in Pro. Right. Now, if I open attribute table, first thing first is that the data are in UTC, of course, and none of the data here reflecting the local time zone or local time. Right? They're all showing the UTC. So in order to do that rush hour analysis or some of the simple query, I always have to do the mental uh, time adjustment, right? Or another option could be to have a string field. But the problem with the string field is that when you want to run some query such as find everything that happened between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock, it's not going to work. Or some duration, you can say, hey, find everything starting for 4 hour window starting from 2 o'clock. It's not going to work. So you really have to have your date and time stored as date time. So UTC is not going to work in my case. And you can say, what if we use preferred time zone, right? And set to one particular time zone, like the Pacific time zone. Will that work? Let's try that. So I have another service where the time zone is set to preferred. If I add that in ArcGIS Pro, now open the attribute table. First of all, if I hover over, you see the time zone is set to Pacific. Right? And here the incidents that happen in the Los Angeles, yes, it shows the local time zone. It happened 4:30, right? But the other one that happened in New York, it is not showing the New York time. It is instead showing the Pacific time because in the New York time when it happened, it was 4:30. At the same time, basically that was 1:30 in Pacific time. So if I run the same query that I ran before, It's only going to find only one incident. It will not find the incident that happened in New York. So what can we do to solve that problem? So starting at 10:00, we introduced a new concept called unknown time zone. The way you can set that is that by first of all you have to publish it from ArcGIS Pro, right? Unfortunately, ArcGIS Pro sharing UI user experience has not caught up with it, so you have to publish it first from ArcGIS Pro and then go to the manager side, go to the and edit that service, go back to the same parameters that I showed in the past in the previous demo, and set the time zone to unknown. So when you set a time zone to unknown, we are basically telling the service to not to do any conversion at all. Remember, I told you before that the REST API specs says that date times are always in UTC with one exception, and this is that exception. When you set to unknown, map service or feature service will not do any conversion. It will just pass it as is, and it's asking the client to do the same thing. It is asking the client to not convert the data or adjust the data to any time zone. You just display them the way it comes to you. So now if I go back to my service, and here is that service. If I add that in Pro, and open the attribute table, and you see right away that data that's coming here and displayed are showing the local data in the local time zone. It says 4:30. If I hover over that on the field itself, the tooltip says the time zone is none. It's basically I am not aware of the time zone. I will just display the time zone as it comes to me. And if I run this query that I did before, right, it will select both features exactly the way we do that the enterprise database. What if editing? Let's say there's some, there was another incident happened in Detroit. Okay, I'm gonna add that. Okay. I'll just add some attributes. Okay, it's again flat tire, and the local time zone I will say same thing. The very same day at 4:30 local time zone. Detroit. Apply it, save it. Right. Now apply that. Okay. I'm sorry, it didn't get applied. Okay. Now if I go back and open my data that's coming from my enterprise database, right? I see that it's already showed here. You can see that. And if I click open that attributes in pop-up window, you can see that it's maintaining the same one that I applied. But this time, instead of directly editing that one, I edited that through the feature service. So when you have the data coming from multiple time zones, you have two strategies. One is to adjust everything to one time zone, which might work in some cases. In other cases, it might not work. And that's where you have to use or rely on this unknown time zone, which tells feature service or map service to do not perform any conversion while you are returning a result, or you are taking a editing request, and you are asking this application, client application, to do the same. Do not perform any adjustment, just show the data as is. Okay, to wrap it up, we talked about why time zone setting is very important. If you do not do that, you will get data incorrectly displayed in different applications, right? Then we talked about preferred time zone. which is new starting at 10.9, right? It's supported by map service and feature service, both in hosted and non-hosted environment. To author prefer time zone, you have to use ArcGIS Manager for non-hosted services. For hosted feature services, you have to use Admin API, and we talked about a blog that described how to do that. And then there is the unknown time zone, again, which is new, starting at 10.9. Um, it's all about passing the data as is, which is very useful when data are coming from multiple time zones. It is supported in the enterprise map service and feature service. Unfortunately, it is not supported for hosted, um, whether it's the enterprise or ArcGIS Online. They do not support that as of now. And ArcGIS Pro is the only client that supports it. Hopefully, JavaScript API, they're actually planning to catch up and support this very soon. That is all we have. On behalf of Gary and I, thank you for attending this session. We'd like to continue this conversation with you. If you'd like to connect, please feel free to click the below presenter additional expert titles to schedule a chat or meeting with us. And also, please do not forget to leave your feedback in the link below. Thank you. Hope to see you soon.